I'm really excited about this next presentation, and you should be too. Who in the room has heard of the New York Times? I'm sorry, can we do that again? I want to see every hand up. Who in the room has heard of the New York Times? Okay, now, same thing. Who in the room has read something, some point from the New York Times? Every hand up, good, okay, we're doing fine. Hannah Fairfield is an amazing person who's doing an amazing thing. They started a climate team at the New York Times about a year ago? A year ago. What is this thing? She said the team exists to produce visual, explanatory, and investigative journalism at a time when the calamities caused by climate change seem to be intensifying. She's going to show you what and how. Hannah was born and grew up in a place called Fairbanks, Alaska. And so as we're getting ready to go to Alaska, this is a really terrific thing. She recalls that she could dig in her yard when she was a kid, down to the permafrost, a lot of which does not exist anymore. So she has seen in her lifetime change, and that is what she does in her job. She tries to capture that, explain that with a whole team, using data, illustrations, all the rest. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to turn it over to Hannah. So Hannah, come on up, it's all yours. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to go back for a second. Yep, that's the intro slide. Thank you so much for having me here today. It is incredibly exciting to see this room full of ideas and vibrancy and energy and people who really want to embrace this kind of storytelling. So as Frank said, I've been at the Times for about over 16 years, and I've been the climate editor for a little over 1. And one of the joys of being the climate editor at the New York Times is that I get to send people to places like Easter Island. And this was a piece that was published earlier this year, and it kicked off a series that I'm really excited about that looks at how climate change is affecting and in many cases eroding cultural history and cultural identity in a lot of places. And so we sent Nick Casey, who is a wonderful correspondent, and Josh Hainer, who's a Pulitzer Prize-winning photographer and has done a lot of drone photography. And so this is one of the pieces that I was really excited about this year. So beautiful imagery is something that I really like to tell stories with. Photography, data visualization, video, AR, VR, there's a lot of really neat things that you're going to hear about from the next speaker that I think are really interesting. But looking for evidence, looking beyond the beauty, looking for evidence of climate change and its effects or something that I care really strongly about. This is also a part of the Easter Island story. And what I wanted to do is to take a look at the island itself, its remoteness, and where these historic statues are on the island. So we mapped out all of them. The little red dots are an individual statue. And so we brought you in. First, I showed you a drone video of the statue, and then I bring you to the island. And then I want to pull you back and give you some global context about where this thing is. It's in the middle of the ocean. It is far from anything. It is only 11 miles or so, tip to tip. And it is really, really at risk of being eroded from major storms and from sea level rise. So if you look at that piece, you think about the data that we were able to lay on the map. And so I'm interested in letting data tell stories in really interesting ways. And I like to look to see what data can reveal, to teach people about something that they didn't necessarily know before. So I look for surprise and revelation and what can I take away from this? This piece on Greenland is from a couple of years ago, and it was really one of the first pieces that I worked on and started to really get excited about what we could do with visual journalism and climate change. So this, again, the same photographer, you might notice his style now. He went to Greenland, and we said, see what you can capture out on the ice. Greenland is a place where It's incredibly remote. It was very dangerous to be out on the ice because the ice is full of holes. It's like Swiss cheese. You can't walk around places like this, but you could send a drone out there. So it was one of the really first good examples of the times using drone photography to do the actual reporting. We could not safely send a correspondent out, but we could send a drone. And so some of the things that we did with this were we took some satellite imagery and we scissored it actually to some drone imagery, so you could get this sense of scale of continent all the way down to the river. That's the same river that I just showed you, and then all the way down to the story of the scientists living in that tent, studying that river, watching to see how much of the ice was actually melting. They were studying this one particular river, sending lots of different monitors into the river, watching them as they flowed, and then they'd go underneath the ice, and they would ping back to satellites to get the data. So I want to surprise you with a lot of this data, and I want to layer it on top. I want to begin to layer data on top. So as I walked you through Greenland, I've showed you the individual river. Now you might have a little bit of relationship with that river. You know what that looks like. And then I showed you the river on the continent scale. And what this does is actually work backwards. Now I'm starting with a tent, and I've told you all about the orange tent and the scientists. And now I'm scaling you back out, and I'm showing you the river again, and I'm layering data on top to tell you how much water is actually being melted. And then I want to show you that it's not just one river. It's hundreds of rivers in Greenland that are melting at this incredible, incredible rate. And that is what I was hoping would really evoke and begin to evoke some surprise. Alaska. How many of you have been to Alaska? Wow, that's pretty impressive for a group like this. I was born there. I lived there until I was 15 years old. I did indeed have permafrost in my backyard that I can go and dig up. But you can't do that now, not in that house, in that neighborhood in Fairbanks, because a lot of the permafrost has started to erode. So that blue is where permafrost was in 2010. And by 2050, which is not that long from now, that's how much is going to be left. And so the red is what's going to be lost. That's just a little bit over 30 years. I mean, think about where you're going to be in 30 years. Most of you will be in the middle of your careers. And I hope that you'll be telling really important stories about this. Fortunately, our brains are incredibly good at layering data. So what I just showed you about that Alaska piece, you got the geography of Alaska. We sort of established a baseline. Here's the permafrost right now. Here's the permafrost in 30 years. And then we did a quick math subtraction, and the red was the difference between them. So our brains got that right away, super, super quickly. And you can use data information on top of maps to get a lot of information to readers really quickly. And in that, you can use this element of surprise. You can tell people something that they didn't really understand before. And this set of maps is one that we did very early in the creation of the climate team. And I really like it. You can read it for a second and kind of absorb it. So the one that's a little bit more orangey it's a survey from Yale. They had excellent climate change communication data. And the orangish one is about asking people, do you think that global warming will harm people in the United States? And I do the color split at 50%. So you've got sort of browns, and then you've got blues for below 50%. And most people in the United States think, you tell me, global warming will harm people in the United States. Do most people in the United States, what do they think? What color is that map? Okay. Yeah, so most people think that global warming is going to harm people in the United States. The map next to it becomes the personal question. Do you think that global warming will harm you personally? What's the answer to that? No. So That right there is fascinating to me. So they know, people understand this is happening. They understand that it's harmful, but they don't think it affects their lives. And that set of maps, which is both beautiful and sophisticated, and also not very hard to put together with the technology that we have nowadays, there's so many stories in that, right? In that set of maps alone, there's so many good stories. There's so many local stories about what that means and that disparity in perception and communication. So I know it's really cold out right now, but in terms of sort of really interesting cutting-edge data visualization, last year I got really excited about looking at early spring. There was tons of the cherry blossoms in DC were out really early. There was a lot of talk about early spring. So this is last year's data. So I wanted to see whether or not the spring that felt early actually was early. And so this is days early against just a 30-year average. 30 years is what a lot of climate scientists like to use to talk about sort of the difference between weather and climate. So 30 years is like a nice, good, substantial amount of time. So did spring arrive early? Last year it did. This year, slightly less so. But it did. And we put together this fun thing. And then I also wanted, this is again last year's data, I also wanted to really kind of drive the point home. So where, in fact, was spring really early? So last year it was really in, a lot of it was in this region. Why is spring arriving early? The world is in fact getting a lot warmer. We have a lot of data to show that. And this is what a warmer world looks like. So this data is focused on days every year above 95 degrees. How many people know what 95 degrees feels like? Yeah. It's hot. It's really hot. It's what scientists define as extreme heat. So, we all know what that feels like. It's uncomfortable. So this is projecting forward where in the world you're going to see days per year above 95 degrees. So the hottest pink that we used on this is 200 days per year. Try to imagine that. Try to just wrap your head around 200 days out of 365 where the temperature is above 95 degrees. And then you think, well, it is a lot of areas in the world. But then look at the United States. Look at the southern United States. Think about Phoenix and about how they couldn't use certain planes in the airport in Phoenix last summer because it was too hot. Again, a lot of local stories, global data set, local stories, really interesting connections to be made. So it's not your imagination. Summers really are getting hotter. And I wanted to be able to use data to not only map it, but to show people exactly why that was. This is a histogram. And it shows summer temperatures in the northern hemisphere. And it shows baseline, which is that right here. And then I'm showing you not 20 years ahead or 50 years ahead, but I'm actually showing you where we are right now. So the blue, you can see, is cold, and the dark blue is extremely cold. In the baseline, you can kind of see that we do get quite a bit of a few decades ago, we got quite a bit of extremely cold weather. And then the orange is hot, and then the red is extremely hot. The histogram is only moving in one direction. So we're still getting cold and extremely cold weather, but the slice of the histogram is significantly smaller than it was decades ago. Tell me what's happening to the red, the extremely hot. Yeah, so you can see where in the histogram it used to be an extreme. It used to be out here. The whole histogram is shifting. And now you can see right there, there's a lot of red. And that histogram is going to keep moving over. So we're going to continue to experience cold weather, but it's very likely that there's going to be less of it. And we will continue to experience really hot weather, and it's quite likely that there will be more of it. So the more that people can understand a data visualization like that and the data behind it and the trends behind it, the more I feel like as journalists, we can do our jobs to inform our readers' thinking. This is, there we go. This is a piece that we published the day that the announcement was made that the U.S., that Trump was going to pull the U.S. out of the climate deal. And so what I wanted to do is to frame an analytical piece off the news that looked at how much carbon emissions, just total carbon emissions over time, each of the countries have contributed. And so we did the United States as the blue and the first one, and then you can see the United States kind of behind all of the others. And that there have been a lot of other countries that have had really sharp increases. But if you look at the total over time, you see that there's just a really strong relationship. That the US is the biggest carbon polluter in history. Thank you very much. I have left. Q&A is some of my favorite parts, and so I have left time at the end to do that. But the first thing I'm going to do is I have a question. Oh, I need my presentation back. I have a question for you. Can I get it back? There's one more slide at the end. Oh, there we go. So this was an interactive that we published last year, and it was quiz-based. This was the whole piece. If you fix this one problem, you will, in fact, potentially fix a big piece of the climate puzzle. So there's no single solution, but there is one that quantitatively is more effective than the others. And so I'm asking you guys. So the story was you had to come to this, you had to pick one, and then we gave you the story depending on whether or not you had answered yes, answered correctly or not. So I would like a show of hands, all right? Building more wind farms, is that the most effective? Wow, okay. Eating less meat worldwide? Yeah, very, very effective. But it's not the answer. Improving air conditioners? Switching to mass transit. Interesting. You guys are all focused on meat. All of these make a really, really big difference. But if we figure out air conditioning, that is going to make the biggest difference. And there's an element of surprise to that. You know, a few of you put your hands up. Possibly those of you who had seen this last year, or possibly those of you who are really aware. As the world gets hotter, more and more people need to regulate their environments. And the way we do that is through air conditioning. And the way air conditioning works right now is not particularly energy efficient. And so there's a lot of really good work to be done on that front. So that was my question to you. Now I'm happy to take
Bravo, bravo. Love that, love that. So I got to tell you, Grace, anybody in the audience from India? Anybody from India? The Mlundra's from India. Anybody else? So I was at a dinner party with a very good friend of mine about a year ago. And he sent a question to everybody before dinner to come and talk about the one most unobvious thing that they had experienced or discovered in their lives that they felt was unobvious, but that blew them away. And people had all different kind of things. But the guy from India came and he said it was air conditioning. Because he said when he went back to the place where he grew up, which was so unbearably hot when he was a kid, but now has been air conditioned, it has been completely transformed. And when you think about that and that map that you put up with the 95 degree, whoa, whoa, whoa. So this is just amazing and fascinating. Is this a new form of storytelling because you can take all this data and make it so visual? Is this something that's relatively new?
I feel like the form itself is not new, but what we've been able to do is take the way we've been telling stories for many years, words, images, video, Data visualization has been around for quite a while. I was a graphics editor at the New York Times for many, many years before I became the climate editor. So I do have a good history in data visualization, and that's been around for about 20 years. The difference is now we're using all those tools together. So when I think about telling a story, I don't necessarily think about checking the buckets of, do I have the correspondent to write the 1,000 words, 5,000 words, whatever that's going to be? Do I have the photographer? Do I have the video? Do I have the graphics? I don't think about that. I think about what the story wants to be, and then I think about the right medium to tell that story. And maybe that's just going to be photography with just enough text and voice and individual to be able to lead you through it. Maybe it's just going to be a data visualization. The 95-degree piece that I showed you, that was the story. You understood it right away. You didn't need to read the 600 words necessarily that went along with it. If I had put them up and if you had read them, you would be a little bit more informed. But the story you saw right away. So that's what's different, is that I think we're getting savvier about choosing the form to tell the story.
New York Times now has 2.5 million digital-only subscribers, which is a phenomenal number. What are you finding in terms of your audience interest in this kind of storytelling now that you have such a large online pool?
What am I finding?
How does the audience react to this? Are they using it? Are they using it enthusiastically? Do they spend time with it?
They spend quite a bit of time with it. We've really had a strong response, particularly to some of our data storytelling, and definitely to our visual storytelling. So that Easter Island piece that I showed, there was a very big response to it, and we really let the imagery lead the whole story. We opened with the drone imagery. We had really the map that I showed you was in fact a kind of visual nut graph. And we had lots and lots of people write to us and say, you know, this form is the best way to tell this story. They found it very evocative and emotional. And I found, you know, with even slightly more complicated data visualization pieces like the ones that I've showed you, people have really sought us out to say, I understand that in a way that I didn't before. And that's the kind of thing that makes me really excited.
I was going to ask you, so they're saying, I understand it in ways I didn't understand it before. Is it changing minds?
I hope so. I really do.
Do you have any data on that?
About changing minds?
Well, you would do before. I mean, you could do testing and surveys on that. I mean, we could do that actually here. I mean, we could do some of that research. It's very interesting to see.
There are places like Yale that I mentioned, and a few other sort of larger scale polling areas that have looked at changing views of climate change and global warming over time. But we haven't actually sat down to say, are you changing your minds because of the New York Times? I don't have a data point on that.
Minute or two for questions from the audience. Who's got one? Yes, ma'am. Yep.
Hi, thank you so much.
Grab the mic. Tell us who you are, where you're from, and if you're fast and we're fast, we'll get a couple in.
Hi, my name's Lily Werlinick. I'm a sophomore at GW, and I'm a political communication major. So because of my background, I want to know, your stories are incredible. I've read a ton of them. But I'm wondering what your call to action is for average citizens who aren't living in places that are like Easter Island or Alaska that are facing more immediate causes of climate change. Like, what can I do? What can the average global citizens do to counteract the stories that you write about?
That's an excellent question. Thank you so much. And I think the 2 US maps that I put up is something that you can think a lot more about. I saw a lot of you, I think, in the audience who saw some element of surprise with those maps. And so there's clearly an information gap there. And certainly, you know, I talk a lot with our political reporters about those kind of questions. And in terms of what people can do, talking to elected officials is one of the most powerful tools that as citizens everybody really has. And so I would encourage, when you're feeling about, you know, personal action and collective action, I think that that's an area that we have a lot of sort of room and space to focus on.
Question from this side of the room? In the back.
Hi, my name is Max Hermanson, SUNY ESF.
Environmental Science and Forestry.
Yeah.
Just want to make sure everybody knows what ESF is.
I'm wondering what you hope to achieve by writing these stories, and Because the New York Times is a liberal newspaper, so do you think you're like kind of just preaching to the choir?
No,
article
I
on Easter.
don't think that we're preaching to the choir. I think in terms of what I am hoping to do is spread knowledge. I feel like in terms of journalism, there is so much that can be done to take good research and good information and synthesize it and find the stories that can reach people. And people choose to change their own lives, but what I want to do is be able to give them the information and some of the emotion and the knowledge to be able to enact change if they want to, and basically sort of broaden their knowledge base and their insight about this particular topic. And I do feel very strongly about that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
One last question. If we've got one last question, right here on the aisle, and then we're done.
Hey, how you doing? My name is Sebastian Solis. I'm majoring in political science here at GW. So I have very little exposure to this, and I want to know, does New York Times provide any sort of toolkits that I can provide any of my peers so I can possibly train myself and essentially train them on what's so important about this conference that we're all here today?
Toolkits. In terms
Toolkits
of,
for doing data visualization and that kind of thing. Is that what you're talking about?
Showing my peers, like, hey, this is exactly what I learned today. It's a lot of information. It's condensed down so all of us can really understand, because essentially there's a lot of science down to it. So infographics, everything that you just showed us right now, like infographics.
There are explainers out there?
videos and stuff like that.
Yes, actually, one of the things I did at the end of last year was put together a sort of highlights of the body of our work from last year. And so if you'd like to search Climate New York Times 2017, you'll find a lot of the examples that I showed. And I broke them up into segments that some of them are more political, some of them are more science-based, some of them are very geographic. Basically stories told from around the world. And so that might be a good place if you're interested in sharing that kind of information all in one place. That's where I'd send them.
Or the other thing they could do is come to us and take a class with us or Dr. Cheers, and we'll teach them how to do infographics. How's that? I had to get a little commercial in there. Before you go, let me show you a piece that, speaking of data, that one of our StoryFest finalists did. Catherine Baker from Columbia. Is Catherine here? Catherine? No, she was, I thought. Maybe not. Let me put this up if we can. So this is counting calories, count your carbon. Consumers around the world growing increasingly concerned where their food comes from, how they can create both sustainable and healthy eating patterns. So we have a peanut butter sandwich. Next slide. And she breaks the peanut butter sandwich down by calories, grams of fat, grams of carbohydrates, protein, fiber, and the emissions per calorie that your peanut butter sandwich contributes. So that's capturing some data. What do you think? How'd she do?
I think it's great. I think that kind of information on a individual level. I had peanut butter toast for breakfast, so now I know what my footprint was.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you so much. I know how busy you are for coming here and sharing this with you. It's been absolutely fabulous.
Thank you.